Hello, everybody. Tonight we are going to be reading Value, Price, and Profit by Karl Marx. Yeah. Sorry for not uploading a video in a while. I've been pretty busy with, school and stuff. But, I hope this is, entertaining. So without further ado, here is Value, Price, and Profit by Karl Marx. Preliminary. Citizens, before entering into the subject matter, allow me to make a few preliminary remarks. There reigns now on the continent a real epidemic of strikes and a general clamor for a rise of wages. The question will turn up at our Congress. You, as the head of the International Association, ought to have settled convictions upon this paramount question. For my own part, I considered it therefore my duty to enter fully into the matter, even at the peril of putting your patience to a severe test. Another preliminary remark I have made in regard to Citizen Weston. He has not only proposed to you, but has publicly defended in the interest of the working class, as he thinks, opinions he knows to be the most unpopular with the working class. Such an exhibition of moral courage all of us must highly honor. I hope that, despite the unvarnished style of my paper, at its conclusion he will find me agreeing with what appears to me the just idea lying at the bottom of his theses, which, however, in their present form, I cannot but consider theoretically false and practically dangerous. I shall now at once proceed to the business before us. Part 1. Production and Wages. Citizen Weston's argument rested, in fact, upon two premises. Firstly, the amount of national production is a fixed thing, a constant quantity or magnitude, as the mathematicians would say. Secondly, that the amount of real wages, that is to say, of wages measured by the quantity of the commodities they can buy, is a fixed amount, a constant magnitude. Now, his first assertion is evidently erroneous. Year after year, you will find that the value and mass of production increase, that the productive powers of the national labor increase, and that the amount of money necessary to circulate this increasing production continuously changes. What is true at the end of the year, and for different years compared with each other, is true for the average day of the year. The amount or magnitude of national production changes continuously. It is not a constant but a variable magnitude, and apart from changes in population, it must be so, because of the continuous change in the accumulation of capital and the productive powers of labor. It is perfectly true that if a rise in the general rate of wages should take place today, that rise, whatever its ulterior effects might be, would, by itself, not immediately change the amount of production. It would, in the first instance, proceed from the existing state of things. But if before the rise of wages the national production was variable and not fixed, it will continue to be variable and not fixed after the rise of wages. But suppose the amount of national production to be constant instead of variable, and even then our friend Weston considers a logical conclusion that would still remain a gratuitous assertion. If I have a given number, say 8, the absolute limits of this number do not prevent its parts from changing their relative limits. If profits were 6 and wages 2, wages might increase to 6 and profits decrease to 2, and still the total amount remain 8. The fixed amount of production would by no means prove the fixed amount of wages. How then does our friend Weston prove this fixity? By asserting it. But even conceding him his assertion, it would cut both ways while he presses on it only in one direction. If the amount of wages is a constant magnitude, then it can be neither increased nor diminished. If then, in enforcing a temporary rise of wages, the working men act foolishly, the capitalists, in enforcing a temporary fall of wages, would not act less foolishly. Our friend Weston does not deny that under certain circumstances, the working men can enforce a rise of wages, but their amount being naturally fixed, there must follow a reaction. On the other hand, he knows that the capitalists can enforce a fall of wages and, indeed, continuously try to enforce it. According to the principle of the constancy of wages, a reaction ought to follow in this case, not less than in the former. The working men, therefore, reacting against the attempt at it, or the act of lowering wages, would act rightly. They would, therefore, act rightly in enforcing a rise of wages, because every reaction against the lowering of wages is an action for raising wages. According to Citizen Weston's own principle of the constancy of wages, the working men ought, therefore, under certain circumstances, to combine and struggle for a rise of wages. If he denies this conclusion, he must give up the premise from which it flows. He must not say that the amount of wages is a constant quantity, but that although it cannot and must not rise, it can and must fall, whenever capital pleases to lower it. If the capitalist pleases to feed you upon potatoes instead of upon meat, and upon oats instead of upon wheat, you must accept his will as a law of political economy, and submit to it. If in one country the rate of wages is higher than another, in the United States, for example, than in England, you must explain this difference in the rate of wages by a difference between the will of the American capitalist and the will of the English capitalist. A method which would certainly very much simplify not only the study of economic phenomena, but of all other phenomena. But even then we might ask, why? Why the will of the American capitalist differs from the will of the English capitalist? And to answer the question, you must go beyond the domain of will. A person may tell me that God wills one thing in France and another in England. If I summon him to explain this duality of will, he might have the brass to answer me that God wills to have one will in France and another in England, but our friend Weston is certainly the last man to make an argument of such a complete negation of all reasoning. The will of the capitalist is certainly to take as much as possible. What we have to do is not talk about his will, but to inquire to his power, the limits of that power, and the character of those limits. Sorry, I just had to get a little bit of water there. Part 2. Production, Wages, Profits. The address Citizen Weston read to us must have been compressed into a nutshell. All of his reasoning amounted to this. If the working class forces the capitalist to pay 5 shillings instead of 4 shillings in the shape of money wages, the capitalist will return the shape of commodities 4 shillings worth instead of 5 shillings worth. The working class would have to pay 5 shillings for what? Before the rise of wages. They bought with 4 shillings. But why is this the case? Why does the capitalist only return 4 shillings worth for 5 shillings? Because the amount of wages is fixed. By why is it fixed at 4 shillings worth of commodities? Why not at 2 or why not at 3 or 2 or any other sum? If the limit of the amount of wages is settled by an economical law, independent alike of the will of the capitalist and the will of the working man, the first thing Citizen Weston had to do was to state that law and prove it. He ought then, moreover, to have proved that the amounts of wages actually paid at every given moment always corresponds exactly to the necessary amounts of wages and never deviates from it. If, on the other hand, the given limit of the amount of wages is founded on the mere will of the capitalist or the limits of his avarice, it is an arbitrary limit. There is nothing necessary in it. It may be changed by the will of the capitalist and may therefore be changed against his will. Citizen Weston illustrated his theory by telling you that a bowl contains a certain quantity of soup to be eaten by a certain number of persons. An increase in the broadness of the spoons would produce no increase in the amount of soup. He must allow me to find this illustration rather spoony. It reminded me somewhat of the simile employed by Menenius Agrippa when the Roman plebeians struck against the Roman patricians. The patrician Agrippa told them that the patrician belly fed the plebeian members of the body politic. Agrippa failed to show that you feed the members of one man by filling the belly of another. Citizen Weston, on his part, has forgotten that the bowl from which the workmen eat is filled with the whole produce of national labor, and that what prevents them fetching more out of it is neither the narrowness of the bowl nor the scantiness of its contents, but only the smallness of their spoons. By what contrivance is the capitalist enabled to return 4 shillings worth for 5 shillings? By raising the price of the commodity he sells. Now, does a rise and more generally a change in the prices of commodities do the prices of commodities themselves depend on the mere will of the capitalist, or are on the contrary certain circumstances wanted to give effect to that will? If not, the ups and downs, the incessant fluctuations of market prices become an insoluble riddle. As we suppose that no change whatever has taken place either in the productive powers of labor or in the amount of capital and labor employed, or in the value of the money wherein the values of products are estimated, but only a change in the rate of wages, how could that rise of wages affect the price of commodities? Only by affecting the actual proportion between the demand for and the supply of these commodities. It is perfectly true that, considered as a whole, the working class spends and must spend its income upon necessaries. A general rise in the rate of wages would, therefore, produce a rise in the demand for and consequently in the market prices of necessities. The capitalists who produce those necessities would be compensated for the risen wages by the rising market prices of their commodities. But how with the other capitalists who do not produce necessities? And if you must not fancy them a small body, if you consider 2/3 of the national produce are consumed by 1/5 of the population, a member of the House of Commons stated it recently to be but 1/7 of the population, you will understand what an immense proportion of the national produce must be produced in the shape of luxuries or be exchanged for luxuries, and what an immense amount of the necessities themselves must be wasted upon flunkies, horses, cats, so forth. A waste we know from experience to become always much limited with the rising price of necessities. Well, what would be the position of those capitalists who do not produce necessities? For the fall in the rate of profit consequent upon the general rise of wages, they could not compensate themselves by a rise in the price of their commodities, but be because the demand for those commodities would not have increased. Their income would have decreased, and from this decreased income they would have to pay more for the same amount of higher priced necessities. But this would not be all. In their home, as their income had diminished, they would have less to spend upon luxuries, and therefore their mutual demand for their respective commodities would diminish. Consequent upon this diminished demand, the prices of their commodities would fall. In these branches of industry, therefore, the rate of profit would fall, not only in a simple proportion to the general rise in the rate of wages, but in the compound ratio of the general rise of wages, the general price of necessities, and the fall in the price of luxuries. What would the consequence of this difference in the rates of profits for capitalists be employed in the different branches of industry? Why, the consequence that generally obtains whenever, from whatever reason, the average rate of profit comes to differ in different spheres of production. Capital and labor would be transferred to the less remunerative and therefore the less remunerative branches, and this process of transfer would go on until the supply in the one department of industry would have risen proportionally to the increased demand, and would have sunk in the other departments according to the decreased demand. This change affected the general rate of profit would again be equalized in the different branches. As the whole derangement originally rose from a mere change in the proportion of the demand for and supply of different commodities, this cause ceasing, the effect would cease, and prices would have taken place. Would have taken place no change in the productive powers of labor, nor in the aggregate amount of production, but that given amount of production would have changed its form. A greater part of the produce would exist in the shape of necessities, a lesser part in the shape of luxuries, or, what comes to the same, a lesser part would be exchanged for foreign luxuries and be consumed in its original form, or what again comes to the same, a greater part of the native produce would be exchanged for foreign necessities instead of for luxuries. The general rise in the rate of wages would therefore, after a temporary disturbance of market prices, only result in a general fall of the rate of profit without any permanent change in the prices of commodities. If I am told that in the previous argument I assume the whole surplus wages to be spent upon necessities, I can answer that I have made the supposition most advantageous to the opinion of Citizen Weston. If the surplus wages were spent upon articles formerly not entering into the consumption of the working men, the real increase of their purchasing power would need no proof, being, however, only derived from an advance of wages. That increase of their purchasing power must exactly correspond to the decrease of the purchasing power of capitalists. The aggregate demand for commodities would, therefore, not increase, but the constituent parts of the demand would change. The increasing demand on the one side would be counterbalanced by the decreasing demand on the other. Thus, the aggregate demand remaining stationary, no change whatever could take place in the market prices of commodities. You arrive, therefore, at this dilemma. Either the surplus wages are equally spent upon all articles of consumption, then the expansion of demand on the part of the working class must be compensated by the contradiction of demand on the part of the capitalist class, or the surplus wages that are only spent upon some articles whose market prices will temporarily rise. The consequent rise in the rate of profit in some, and the consequent fall in the rate of profit in other branches of industry will produce a change in the distribution of capital and labor, going on until the supply is brought up and the increased demands in the one department of industry, and brought down to the diminished demand in the other departments of industry. On the one supposition, there will occur no change in the prices of commodities. On the other supposition, after some fluctuations of market prices, the exchangeable values of commodity will subside to the former level. On both suppositions, the general rise in the rate of wages will ultimately result in nothing else but a general fall in the rate of profit. Stir up your powers of imagination. Citizen Weston requested you to think of the difficulties which a general rise of English agricultural wages from 9 shillings to 18 shillings would produce. Think, he exclaimed, of the immense rise in the demand for necessities and the consequent fearful rise in their prices. Now, all of you know that the average wages of the American agricultural laborer amount to no more than double that of the English agricultural laborer. Although the prices of agricultural produce are lower than in the United States than in the United Kingdom, although the general relations of capital and labor obtained in the United States the same as in England, and although the annual amount of production is much smaller in the United States than in England. Why, then, does our friend ring this alarm bell? Simply to shift the real question before us. A sudden rise of wages from 9 shillings to 18 shillings would be a sudden rise to the amounts of 100%. Now we are not at all discussing the question whether the general rates of wages in England could be suddenly increased by 100%. We have nothing at all to do with the magnitude of the rise, which in every practical instance must depend on and be suited to given circumstances. We have only to inquire how a general rise in the rate of wages, even if restricted to 1%, will act. Dismissing friend Weston's fancy rise of 100%, I propose calling your attention to the real rise of wages that took place in Great Britain from 1849 to 1859. You are all aware of the 10 hours bill, or rather, 10.5 hours bill, introduced since 1848. This was one of the greatest economical changes we have witnessed. It was a sudden and compulsory rise of wages, not in some local trades, but in the leading industrial branches by which England sways the markets of the world. It was a rise of wages under circumstances singularly unpropitious. Dr. Urey, a professor senior, and all the other official economical mouthpieces of the middle class, the aristocracy was the upper class of Great Britain, while the capitalists composed what was known to Marx as the middle class, proved, and I must say, upon much stronger grounds than those of our friend Weston, that it would be the death knell of English industry. They proved that it not only amounted to a simple rise of wages, but to a rise of wages initiated by, and based upon a diminution of the quantity of labor employed. They asserted that the 12th hour you wanted to take from the capitalist was exactly the only hour from which he derived his profit. They threatened a decrease of accumulation, rise of prices, loss of markets, stinting of production. A consequent reaction upon wages, ultimate ruin. In fact, they declared Maximilian Robespierre's maximum laws to be a small affair compared to it, and they were right in a certain sense. Well, what was the result? A rise in the money of wages of the factory operatives, despite the curtailing of the working day, a great increase in the number of factory hands employed, a continuous fall in the prices of their products, a marvelous development in the productive powers of their labor, an unheard of progressive expansion of the markets for their commodities. In Manchester, at the meeting in 1860, of the Society for the Advancement of Science, I myself heard Mr. Newman confess that he, Dr. Urey Sr., and all other propounders of economical science had been wrong, while the instinct of the people had been right. I mention Mr. W. Newman, not Professor Francis Newman, because he occupies an eminent position in economical science as the contributor to an editor of Mr. Thomas Hook's History of Prices, that magnificent work which traces the history of prices from 1793 to 1856. If our friend Weston's fixed idea of a fixed amount of wages and economical science, a fixed amount of production, a fixed degree of the productive power of labor, a fixed permanent will of the capitalist, and all other fixedness were correct, Professor Senior's woeful forebodings would have been right, and Robert Owen, who already in 1816 proclaimed a general limitation of the working day, the first preparatory step to the emancipation of the working class, and actually in the teeth of the general prejudice inaugurated it on his own hook in his cotton factory at New Lanark, would have been wrong. In the very same period during which the introduction of the 10 Hours Bill and the rise of wages consequent upon it occurred, there took place in Great Britain, for reasons which it would be out of place to enumerate here, a general rise in agricultural wages. Although it is not required for my immediate purpose, in order not to mislead you, I shall make some preliminary remarks. If a man got 2 shillings weekly wages, and if his wages rose to 4 shillings, the rate of wages would have risen by 100%. This would seem a very magnificent thing if expressed as a rise in the rate of wages, although the actual amount of wages, 4 shillings weekly, would still remain a wretchedly small, a starvation pittance. You must not, therefore, allow yourselves to be carried away by the high-sounding percents in rates of wages. You must always ask what it was the original amount. Moreover, you will understand that if there were 10 men each receiving 2 shillings per week, 5 men each receiving 5 shillings, and 5 men each receiving 11 shillings weekly, the 20 men together would receive 100 shillings or 5 euros weekly. If then a rise by, say, 5 pounds weekly, if then a rise by, say, 20% upon the aggregate sum of their weekly wages took place, there would be an advance from 5 pounds to 6 pounds. Taking the average, we might say that the general rate of wages has risen by 20%, although in fact the wages of the 10 men had remained stationary. The wages of the one lot of 5 men had risen from 5 shillings to 6 shillings only, and the wages of the other lot from 55 to 70. One half of the men would not have improved at all their position. 1/4 would have improved it by an imperceptible degree, and only 1/4 would have bettered it really. Still, reckoning by the average, the total amount of wages those 20 men would have increased by 25%. And as far as the aggregate capital that employs them and the prices of commodities they produce are concerned, it would be exactly the same as if all of them had equally shared in the average rise of wages. In the case of agricultural labor, the standard wages being very different in the different countries of England and Scotland, the rise affected them very unequally. Lastly, during the period when that rise of wages took place, counteracting influences were at work, such as the new taxes consequent upon the Russian War, the extensive demolition of the dwelling houses of the agricultural laborers, and so forth. Having premised so much, I proceed to state that from 1849 to 1859 there took place a rise of about 40% in the average rate of the agricultural wages of Great Britain. I could give you ample details in proof of my assertion, but for the present purpose, I think it is sufficient to refer you to the conscientious and critical paper read in 1860 by the late Mr. John C. Morton at the London Society of Arts on the forces used in agriculture. Mr. Morton gives the returns from bills and other authentic documents which he had collected from about 100 farmers residing in 12 Scotch and 35 English counties. According to our friend Weston's opinion, and taken together with the simultaneous rise in the wages of factory operatives, there ought to have occurred a tremendous rise in the prices of agricultural produce during the period of 1849 to 1859. But what is that? But what is the fact? Despite the Russian War and the consecutive unfavorable harvests from 1854 to 1856, the average price of wheat, which is the leading agricultural produce of England, fell from about 3 pounds per quarter for the years of 1838 to 1848, about 2 pounds 10 shillings per quarter for the years of 1849 to 1859. This constitutes a fall in the price of wheat of more than 16% simultaneously, with an average rise of agricultural wages of 40%. During the same period, if we compare its end with its beginning, 1849 with 1859, there was a decrease in the official pauperism from 930,000 4,419 to 860,470. The difference being 73,949. A very small decrease, I grant, and which the following years was again lost, but still a decrease. It might be said that consequent upon the abolition of corn laws, the import of foreign corn was more than doubled during the period of 1849 to 1859, as compared with the period from 1838 to 1848. And what of that? From Citizen Weston's standpoint, one would have expected that this sudden, immense, and continuously increasing demand upon foreign markets must have sent up the prices of agricultural produce there to a frightful height. The effect of the increased demand remaining the same, whether it comes from without or from within. What was the fact? Apart from some years of failing harvests, during all that period of the ruins of the fall in prices of corn formed a standing theme of declamation in France. The Americans were again and again compelled to burn their surplus produce, and Russia, if we were to believe Mr. Urquhart, prompted the Civil War in the United States because her agricultural exports were crippled by the Yankee competition in the markets of Europe. Reduced to its abstract form, Citizen Weston's argument would come to this: every rise in demand occurs always on the basis of a given amount of production. It can, therefore, never increase the supply of the articles demanded, but can only enhance their money prices. Now, the most common observation shows that an increased demand will, in some levels, leave the market prices of commodities altogether unchanged, and will, in other instances, cause a temporary rise of market prices, followed by an increased supply, followed by a reduction of the prices to their original level, and in many cases below their original level, whether the rise of demand springs from surplus wages or from any other cause, does not at all change the conditions of the problem. From Citizen Weston's standpoint, the general phenomenon was as difficult to explain as the phenomenon occurring under the exceptional circumstances of a rise of wages. His argument had, therefore, no peculiar bearing whatever upon the subject we treat. It only expressed his perplexity at accounting for the laws by which an increase of demand produces an increase of supply, instead of an ultimate rise of market prices. Part 3, wages and currency. On the second day of the debate, our friend Weston clothed his old assertions in new forms. He said, consequent upon a general rise in money wages, more currency will be wanted to pay the same wages. The currency being fixed, how can you pay with this fixed currency increased money wages? First, the difficulty arose from the fixed amount of commodities accruing to the working man, despite his increase of money wages. Now it arises from the increased money wages, despite the fixed amount of commodities. Of course, if you reject his original dogma, his secondary grievance will disappear. However, I shall now show that this currency question has nothing at all to do with the subject before us. In your country, the mechanism of payments is much more perfected than in any other country of Europe. Thanks to the extent and concentration of the banking system, much less currency is wanted to circulate the same amount of values and to transact the same or a greater amount of business. For example, as far as wages are concerned, the English factory operative pays his wages weekly to the shopkeeper, who sends them weekly to the banker, who returns them weekly to the manufacturer, who again pays them away to his working men, and so forth. By this contrivance, the yearly wages of an operative, say, of £52 may be paid by one single sovereign turning round every week in the same circle. Even in England, the mechanism is less perfect than in Scotland. It is not everywhere equally perfect, and therefore we find, for example, that in some agricultural districts much more currency is wanted to circulate on much smaller amounts of values. If you cross the Channel, you will find that the money wages are much lower than in England, but that they are circulated in Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and France by a much larger amount of currency. The same sovereign will not be so quickly intercepted by the banker or returned to the industrial capitalist, and therefore, instead of one sovereign circulating £52 yearly, you want perhaps 3 sovereigns to circulate yearly wages to the amount of £25. Thus, by comparing continental countries with England, you will see at once that the low money wages require a much larger currency for their circulation than high money wages, and that this is, in fact, a merely technical point, quite foreign to our subject. According to the best calculations I know, the yearly income of the working class of this country may be estimated at £250 million. This immense sum is circulated by about £3 million. Suppose a rise of wages of 50% to take place, then instead of 3 millions of currency, 4.5 millions would be wanted. As a very considerable part of the working man's daily expenses is laid out in silver and copper, that is to say, in mere tokens whose relative value to gold is arbitrarily fixed by law, like that of inconvertible money paper, a rise of money wages by 50% would, in the extreme case, require an additional circulation of sovereigns, say to the amount of 1 million. 1 million now dormant in the shape of bullion or coin, and the cellars of the Bank of England or of private bankers would circulate. But even the trifling expense resulting from the additional minting or the additional wear and tear of that million might be spared, and would actually be spared if any friction should arise from the want of the additional currency. All of you know that the currency of this country is divided into 2 great departments. One sort, supplied by banknotes of different descriptions, is used in the transactions between dealers and dealers, and the larger payments from consumers to dealers, while another sort of currency, metallic coin, circulates in the retail trade. Although distinct, these 2 sorts of currency intermix with each other. Thus, gold coin to a very great extent circulates even in larger payments for all the odd sums under £5. If tomorrow £4 notes or £3 notes or £2 notes were issued, the gold filling these channels of circulation would at once be driven out of them, and flow into those channels where they would be needed from the increase of money wages. Thus, the additional million required by the advance of wages by 50% would be supplied without the addition of one single sovereign. The same effect might be produced without one additional banknote by an additional bill circulation, as was the case in Lancashire for a very considerable time. If a general rise in the rate of wages, for example, of 100%, as Citizen Weston supposed it to take place in agricultural wages, would produce a great rise in the prices of necessities, and, according to his views, require an additional amount of currency not be procured. A general fall in wages must produce the same effect on the same scale in the opposite direction. Well, all of you know that in the years 1858 to 1860 were the most prosperous years for the cotton industry, and that peculiarly the year 1860 stands in that respect unrivaled by the annals of commerce, while at the same time all other branches of industry were most flourishing. The wages of the cotton operatives and of all the cotton industry and of all the other working men connected with their trade stood, in 1860, higher than ever. The American crisis came, and those aggregate wages were suddenly reduced to about 1/4 of their former amount. This would have been in the opposite direction a rise of 400%. If wages rise from 5 to 20, we say, that they rise by 400%. If they fall from 20 to 5, we say that they fall by 75%. We by 75%. But the amount of rise in the one and the amount of fall in the other would would have the but the amount of rise in the one and the amount of fall in the other case would be the same, namely 15 shillings. This, then, was a sudden change in the rate of wages, unprecedented, and at the same time extending over a number of operatives, which, if we count all the operatives not directly engaged in, but indirectly dependent upon the cotton trade, was larger by one half than the amount of agricultural laborers. Did the price of wheat fall? It rose from the annual average of 47 shillings 8 d per quarter per quarter during 3 years, during the 3 years of 1850 to 1860. The annual average of 55 shillings and 10 d per quarter, at 55 shillings $10 per quarter during the 3 years 1861 to 1863. As to the currency, there were coined in the mint of 1861 £8,673,323 against £3,378,792 in 1860. That is to say, there were coined £5,294,440 more in 1861 than in 1860. It is true that the banknote circulation was in 1861 less by 1,319,000 pounds than in 1860. Take this off. There remains still a surplus of currency for the year 1861 as compared with the prosperity year 1860, or to the amount of 3,975,440 pounds, or about 4 million pounds. But the bullion reserve in the Bank of England had simultaneously decreased, not quite to the same, but in an approximating proportion. Compare the year 1862 with 1842. Apart from the immense increase in the value and amount of commodities circulated in 1862, the capital paid in regular transactions for shares, loans, etc., for the railways in England and Wales amounted alone to £320 million, a sum that would have appeared fabulous in 1842. Still, the aggregate amounts in currency in 1862 and 1842 were pretty nearly equal, and generally you will find a tendency to a progressive diminution of currency in the face of enormously increasing value, not only of commodities, but of monetary transactions generally. From our friend Weston's standpoint, this is an unsolvable riddle. Looking somewhat deeper into this matter, he would have found that quite apart from wages, and supposing them to be fixed, the value and mass of commodities to be circulated, and generally the amounts of monetary transactions to be settled, vary daily, and that the amount of banknotes issued varies daily. That the amount of payments realized without the intervention of any money, by the instrumentality of bills, checks, book credits, clearinghouses, varies daily. That, as far as actual metallic currency is required, the proportion between the coin in circulation and the coin in bullion in reserve, or sleeping in the cellars of bank, varies daily. That the amount of bullion absorbed by the national circulation and the amount being sent abroad for international circulation vary daily. He would have found that this dogma of a fixed currency is a monstrous error, incompatible with our everyday movement. He would have inquired into the laws which enable a currency to adapt itself to circumstances so continually changing, instead of turning his misconception to the laws of currency into an argument against the rise of wages. Part 4. Supply and Demand. Our friend Weston accepts the Latin proverb that repetito est mater studiorum, that is to say that repetition is the mother of study, and consequently he repeated his original dogma again under the new form, that the contradiction of currency resulting from an enhancement of wages would produce a diminution of capital, and so forth. Having already dealt with his currency crochet, I consider it quite useless to enter upon the imaginary consequences he fancies to flow from his imaginary currency mishap. I shall proceed at once to reduce his one and the same dogma, repeated in so many different shapes, to its simplest theoretical form. The uncritical way in which he has treated his subjects will become evident from one single remark. He pleads against a rise of wages or against high wages as the result of such a rise. Now, I ask him, what are high wages and what are low wages? Why constitute, for example, 5 shillings weekly low and 20 shillings weekly high wages? If 5 is low as compared with 20, 20 is still lower as compared with 200. If a man was to lecture on the thermometer, and commenced declaiming on high and low degrees, he would impart no knowledge whatever. He must no knowledge whatsoever. He must first tell me how the freezing point is found out, and how the boiling point, and how these standard points are settled by natural laws, not by the fancy of the sellers or makers of thermometers. Now, in regards to wages and profit, Citizen Weston has not only failed to deduce such standard points from economical laws, but he has not even felt the necessity to look after them. He satisfied himself with the acceptance of the popular slang terms of low and high as something having a fixed meaning, although it is self-evident that wages can only be said to be high or low as compared with a standard by which to measure their magnitudes. He will be unable to tell me why a certain amount of money is given for a certain amount of labor, if he should answer me, this was settled by the law of supply and demand. I should ask him, in the first instance, by what law supply and demand are themselves regulated. And such an answer would put him out of court. The relations between the supply and demand of labor undergo perpetual change, and with them the market prices of labor. If the demand overshoots, the supply wages rise. If the supply overshoots, the demand wages sink. Although it might in such circumstances be necessary to test the real state of demand and supply by a strike, for example, or any other method. But if you accept supply and demand as the law regulating wages, it would be as childish as useless to declaim against a rise of wages, because, according to the supreme law you appeal to, a periodical rise of wages is quite as necessary and legitimate as the periodical fall of wages. If you do not accept supply and demand as the law regulating wages, I again repeat the question, why a certain amount of money is given for a certain amount of labor. But to consider matters more broadly, you would be altogether mistaken in fancying that the value of labor or any other commodity whatever is ultimately fixed by supply and demand. Supply and demand regulate nothing but the temporary fluctuations of market prices. They will explain to you why a market price of a commodity rises above or sinks below its value, but they can never account for the value itself. Suppose supply and demand to equilibrate, or as economists call it, to cover each other. Why, the very moment these opposite forces become equal, they paralyze each other and cease to work in one or the other direction. At the moment when supply and demand equilibrate each other and therefore cease to act, the market price of a commodity coincides with its real value, with the standard price round which its market prices oscillate, and inquiring into the same nature of that of value. We have therefore nothing at all to do with the temporary effects on market prices of supply and demand. The same holds true of wages and the prices of all other commodities. Part 5. Wages and prices. Reduced to their simplest theoretical expression, all our friends' arguments resolve themselves into this one dogma: the prices of commodities are determined or regulated by wages. I might appeal to practical observation to bear witness against this antiquated and exploded fallacy. I might tell you that the English factory operatives, miners, shipbuilders, and so forth, whose labor is relatively high-priced, undersell that by the cheapness of their produce all other nations, while the English agricultural laborer, for example, whose labor is relatively low price, is undersold by almost every other nation because of the dearness of his produce. By comparing article with article in the same country, and the commodities of different countries, I might show, apart from some exceptions are more apparent than real, that on average the high-priced labor produces the low-priced, and the low-priced labor produces the high-priced commodities. This, of course, would not prove that the high price of labor in the one and its low price in the other instance are the respective causes of those diametrically opposed effects, but at all events it would prove that the prices of commodities are not ruled by the prices of labor. However, it is quite superfluous for us to employ this empirical method. It might perhaps be denied that Citizen Weston has put forward the dogma the prices of commodities are determined or regulated by wages. In point of fact, he has never formulated it. He said, on the contrary, that profit and rent also form constituent parts of the prices of commodities, because it is out of the prices of commodities that not only the working man's wages, but also the capitalist's profits and the landlord's rents must be paid. But how in his idea are prices formed? First by wages, then an additional percentage is joined to the price on behalf of the capitalist, and another additional percentage on behalf of the landlord. Suppose the wages of the laborer employed in the production of a commodity to be 10. If the rate of profit was 100%, to the wages advanced the capitalist would add 10. If the rate of rent was also 100% upon the wages, there would be an added 10 more, and the aggregate price of a commodity would amount to 30. But such a determination of prices would be simply their determination by wages. If wages in the above case rose to 20, the price of the commodity would rise to 60, and so forth. Consequently, all the superannuated writers on political economy who propound the dogma that wages regulate prices have tried to prove it by treating profit and rent as mere additional percentages upon wages. None of them were, of course, able to reduce the limits of those percentages to any economic law. They seem, on the contrary, to think profits are settled by tradition, custom, and the will of the capitalist, or by some other equally arbitrary and inexplicable method. If they assert that they are settled by the competition between capitalists, they say nothing. That competition is sure to equalize the different rates of profit in different trades or reduce them to one average level, but it can never determine the level itself or the general rate of profit. What do we mean? What do we mean by saying that the prices of commodities are determined by wages? Wages being but a name for the price of labor, we mean that the prices of commodities are regulated by the price of labor, as price is exchangeable value. And in speaking of value, I always speak of exchangeable value. Is exchangeable value expressed in money? The proposition comes to this, that the value of commodities is determined by the value of labor, or that the value of labor is the general measure of value. But How then is the value of labor itself determined? Here we come to a standstill. Of course we come to a standstill if we try reasoning logically, yet the propounders of that doctrine make short work of logical scruples. Take our friend Weston, for example. First, he told us that wages regulate the prices of commodities and that consequently, when wages rise, prices must rise. Then he turned round to show us that a rise of wages will be no good because the prices of commodities had risen, and because wages were indeed measured by the prices of commodities and upon which they are spent. Thus we begin by saying that the value of labor determines the value of commodities, and we wind up by saying that the value of commodities determines the value of labor. Thus we move to and fro in the most vicious cycle, and arrive at no conclusion at all. On the whole, it is evident that by making the value of one commodity, say labor, corn, or any other commodity, the general measure and regulator of value, we only shift the difficulty, since we determine one value by another, which on its side wants to be determined. The dogma that wages determine the price of commodities, expressed in most abstract terms, comes to this: value is determined by value. In this tautology means that, in fact, we know nothing at all about value. Accepting this premise, all reasoning about the general laws of political economy turns into mere twaddle. It was therefore the great merit of Ricardo that in his work on the Principles of Political Economy, published in 1817, he fundamentally destroyed the old popular worn-out fallacy that wages determine prices, a fallacy which Adam Smith and his French predecessors had spurned into the really scientific parts of their researches, but which they reproduced in their most exoterical and vulgarizing chapters. Okay, that concludes the first part of value, price, and profit. This was the first. This was the first 5 sections of it, and I'm sorry for any stuttering or tripping over my words. I'm tired right now. It is currently 5 in the morning, so yeah, I'm gonna go to sleep now, and I hope you guys enjoyed. Bye.